Hello, Rob here from the Flanagan Homestead. Today we're going to talk about goats and sheep. We're going to compare and contrast them, how they're similar, how they're different, both in personality and what they eat and then on their needs. And maybe you can decide which one is best for you, or if you want to try to run both on your farm together. I currently have both goats and sheep running in the pasture together. And there's been some things that I expected to happen and some things that I didn't expect to happen. So anyway, let's get started. First thing to talk about is the pasture. They're all out in the pasture. Our local farm store sells goat sheep fence because they use very similar fencing. It's 4x4 holes through the whole thing. It's about 50 inches tall. Anyway, so the fencing that you need is very similar. I find that the sheep very rarely will contest it and are happy to just wander around inside of it. Sometimes I need to put a hot wire down low and up high to keep my goats from challenging the fence, and I have had goats trying to leap over the fence and get underneath the fence. But they tend to be more of an escape artist, but they tend to stay. The sheep tend to stay in without as much hassle. When it comes to eating out in the pasture, they both eat similar things, but they have a different preference and they thrive on things slightly differently. Both goats and sheep can eat the grass. They can also eat the broadleaves, the leaves off the trees, the leaves off of blackberry vines, and that type of thing. But you'll find that the goats prefer broadleaf and to be browsing and foraging like that. And getting up a lot of broadleaves, and they enjoy things that are up higher. It's pretty common for them to lean up on the fence, actually put their feet on the back of another one and reach up and try to get leaves off of a tree. So they prefer broadleaf. They can eat grass and they'll do fine on that, but they definitely prefer more of the broadleaf. Whereas the sheep can eat similar things, but they'll eat blackberry vines and they'll eat leaves off of trees, but they prefer the grass. And usually they'll be wandering around in the pasture with their head down and just mowing the grass. And so the reason I've had goats for many, many years, and the reason I had goats first is the acreage that's behind us. We've got about 5 acres of pasture now, was just almost completely covered with blackberries. And so we started getting goats, and they were eating down the blackberry vines and allowing more sunlight in. And we started throwing pasture grass seed over the areas they cleared. And now most of the 5 acres is clear of blackberries, and we have grass. And so I went from 23 goats at this time last year, and I sold a bunch off to make more room for sheep. And then I got down to keeping my buck and 4 does, and then predators came and killed 3 of those does, so I was down to a buck and 1 doe. Since I've bought a few more does, but then I've also brought in sheep back in here, and that's because we have more grass, and so the sheep are going to graze the grass and keep the grass down much better than the goats ever did or would. The next thing I want to talk about is their personalities. What do you want the animals for? If you want a pet, goats are going to be the answer for you much more than sheep. Both can be trained to be very friendly, but I find that my goats, all of them, I can come up to them, and if I'm feeding them, pet them and stroke them, give them a hug, and even play with them a little bit. Whereas the sheep, they'll come up to me, but they like to stay about arm's distance away. I can put my hand on them, but they don't want a whole lot of attention. They want us to be a little bit standoffish, which is slightly frustrating for me because I do take my animals to the petting zoo at my Christmas tree farm, and the goats come up to all the guests and are very friendly and interactive, and the sheep will want to be a little bit further back. But anyway, our guests get to see both types of animals either way. I referenced at the start of the video some of the things that I didn't expect to have happen when I had my sheep and goats together, and that is simply this. I've quite often seen and heard of and seen myself where you have different types of livestock that are herd animals, and if there's not, they tend to make a big herd combining together and moving around the pasture together. And so when I brought my sheep in, and I only had 2 goats at the time, the few sheep and the goats that I had wanted to feel like they're in a bigger herd, and they did tend to move around together. The sheep kind of on one side and the goats on another, but they were moving around together. But since then, I bought 2 more does in to increase my herd again, and then I had 3 ewes, and then they gave birth to 4 lambs, and so now I have 7 sheep and 4 goats, and that seems to be enough for them to create a herd that they are happy to be separate. Now, on occasion, you'll go out and look, and they'll be moving around the field somewhat together, but most days that I come down here, the sheep are out in the pasture and the goats are closer to the barn and moving around down here. And then when they do work their way out there, the goats go all the way out to the blackberry bushes on the very far side, and the sheep are here, and they don't tend to run together as much. Now, they don't mind being around each other. Both the goats and the sheep are right here, back here behind me, because I gave them a little grain as they're coming in for the night and bringing them into the barn. But they don't mind being around each other, but they aren't drawn to each other as much as I expected. Okay, so I was talking about their diet and what they eat. One of the things that you need to be careful about is the minerals that you put out for your animals. So goats need copper, and copper is toxic for the sheep. And a lot of times you might buy a mineral block or salts or whatnot that have copper in it for your goats, and you don't need that for your sheep. So I personally now have minerals that are very limited in copper, and then there's other ways to get copper for my goats. One of the nice things, though, is their differences in personalities. Inside my barn right here, I have bunk beds and shelves, and the goats jump up from one bunk to the next, and they like to sleep up here, actually higher than my head height, and the sheep never go up there. So I can put stuff that has copper in it if I want up there. The sheep will never touch it. All the goats go up there and they'll find it. They love to bounce and climb, and that's another one of the things about their personalities. Goats are climbers. They're always up on top of things, investigating and trying to get things, and they're escape artists, where again the sheep can be pretty athletic when they need to be, but they don't care to be. They just tend to want to wander around on the ground. Here they are going up on the bunks. They're not on the highest bunk yet. Usually Bibi, where is she? She goes up on the higher bunk. They're on the second bunk down. Cannon is on the lower of the 3 bunks right now. Oh, he's coming up. They love sleeping up there. The sheep, when I do bring them into the barn, because like I said, they don't want to come in the barn, are always down here on the ground. You have to have goat bunk beds if you have goats. One of the biggest differences I've noticed between my sheep and goats are simply this. The weather bothers goats significantly. Cold, wet weather the sheep don't even seem to notice it. When I had the sheep, even when they had couple-day-old lambs and they're wandering around the pasture with them, and I want to bring them in the barn, we're having mixed snow and rain, cold and just coming down in the middle of the night. And the goats, if it's raining, it doesn't matter. They are in the barn. They do not want to be out in the rain. Whereas the sheep, they would have just stood out there all night. They're familiar with the barn. They're comfortable in the barn, but they'll just let it rain and snow on them all night long and stand outside. So especially when the lambs were really young, I'd bring some grain in to entice them into the barn and then close them in and make them stay in all night. But they will not go in the barn and spend the night in the barn on their own. Now, I just mentioned grain, giving grain to my sheep and goats, and I know I always get a lot of people, grain is bad for your animals, don't give them grain. I'm not talking about a lot of grain, and I give them a small amount of grain, and at times I believe grain is good for them. When my ewes were pregnant, they needed a little extra protein. After they delivered, grain gives them a higher percentage of protein than just grazing the pasture, so a little bit of grain is good, and it keeps them friendly and trained. I could give them a call and they'll come running anytime. If I use that call, that means they're going to get a little bit of grain. So I never have to go chase my animals. They always come running to me. Some other general thoughts on goats and sheep. They're both ruminants. They both tend to breed, not always, but they tend to breed in the fall and have their kids in the winter or early spring. They have a gestation period of 5 months, so that's very similar. It's very common for them to be kidding with, the goats kidding and the sheep lambing. 2 is very common. Sometimes you only get 1. Triplets are not unusual, but are very similar. Their sizes are pretty similar. I have Nigerian dwarfs, so my goats are smaller than my Dorper sheep. The sheep in general, I think, are a little broader bodied and carry more weight. They'll produce more meat. When it comes time to butcher, I know there are meat goats that produce a lot of meat, but in general, sheep are a little bit larger, and that's one of the reasons also that we're going more towards sheep and less goats, is because we prefer the taste of lamb to the taste of goat personally. Although there is a huge market for goat meat, although I haven't butchered a ton of my animals, but we will be selecting certain sheep that will be joining us at the dinner table. Another difference between goats and sheep is sheep tend to, especially the ewes, the females, tend to not have horns. Some do, but they generally don't. The rams do. As far as many breeds of goats do have horns, both the male and female. But goats' horns tend to be thinner and more upright, whereas sheep horns, when they do have them, tend to be thicker and more curled back. Another physiological difference is sheep tend to have longer tails, unless you dock them, that are hanging down. Goats tend to have shorter tails, and so the sheep tails are down and the goat tails tend to be shorter and pointed up. If they're healthy and happy, they're wandering around with their tails pointed up. Sheep are hanging down. Another huge difference between the two different types of animals, if you're planning to keep both male and female and breed them, is both males, intact males, can get a little bit ornery, but a buck goat generally isn't that bad. You can handle them, and they're not that aggressive, although they can become aggressive. The bucks tend to, when the females are in heat, they tend to really stink. There's some that are really stinky. Actually, the reason I kept this a specific herd buck for me is it stinks less than the other bucks that I've had. And so, I do smell them, but the barn is not too far from the house, and sometimes it just gets really bad with some goat bucks. And rams do not smell as bad. But when I was talking about being aggressive, it's understood if you're farming and you have a ram in the pasture, don't turn your back on him. He may be friendly today, he may be friendly tomorrow, but at some point in time, if you turn your back on him, you're going to pay the price. And so you need to be careful with a ram. I do have a herd buck for my goats right now. I don't currently have a ram. I'm trying to figure out if I want to bring one in and just be careful around them, or if I just want to send my ewes out on a date to meet some and come back bred. But right now I don't want to have a ram. They can get very aggressive. Speaking of aggressive, rams, if there's a couple rams in the field together and they want to fight each other, they tend to stay on all fours, and we call it ram, and just come and charge at each other and hit each other. The bucks, on the other hand, they tend to rear up on their hind legs and then slam their heads down on each other and charge and more sideswipe each other. I had a few bucklings in the barn when the does went into heat last year. My herd buck, if they went anywhere near those does when they were in heat, he was after them, and they'd try to go up and feed on something, and he would just drive them right into the wall and just pound them and get them out. So the young bucklings learned to stay out of the way. Speaking of bucks, there's my herd buck Cannon right there. And one of the nasty things that goat bucks do is just a strange thing, is when it's time to attract females, they'll put their head between their legs and often urinate on their face. And I guess it's supposed to attract females. I don't think it'd work for me. One other observation I've made, you can see behind me, my property is very sloped, and we have open pasture to the facing the south side, and it's very sloped. The goats definitely prefer to be on the high side. They want to be the high ground. It is very rare for me to find them down lower on the lower elevation along the fence line. I don't know if it's because it's closer to the wood or just lower elevation, or they just like to be up high and they feel safer that they can see things. Whereas the sheep, on the other hand, they'll wander up high, they'll be down low. It doesn't seem to make a difference to them, but the goats want to be on higher elevation. One more thing about care for the animals, they're both going to need similar vaccinations like CDT. Both are going to have very similar hoof care. Their hooves are going to need to be clipped probably at least a couple times a year. Just like your toenails grow and fingernails grow out and need to be clipped, their hooves grow out and they'll start to curl and they'll collect and gather mud and stuff will get in there and they can get hoof rot or other diseases. So you need to, before those curl in too far, you need to clip those off and keep their hooves clean. There you have it, a quick comparison between goats and sheep, with a couple of the major differences being if the weather's bad, goats are inside, sheep don't seem to mind rain, sheep graze grass, goats like broadleaf, and if you want a pet and something that's going to be friendlier, you're probably going to choose the goats. Thanks for joining me on the Flanagan Homestead, where Christmas trees are my business, teaching and cleaning horticulture is my job, and outdoor projects are my passion. Hope to see you again soon. Be blessed, everyone.